Seahawks fans, wherever you may be. Welcome back for another edition of the Seahawks Playbook podcast. Join your host, Bill Alvstad, and co-host, sports writer and football analyst Keith Myers, as we talk Seahawks football.
Hey, Seahawks fans. Welcome back to another episode of the Seahawks Playbook podcast. I'm your host, Bill Alvstad, sitting down with co-host Keith Myers, here to talk Seahawks football and some other teams today. So once in a while, we do these shows where we take a look around the NFC, particularly the NFC West, and that's exactly what we're doing this morning. We're going to take a look at the other teams in the race for the division title this year, and it should be a fun show. Should be kind of a little eye-opener for those who haven't been paying attention, and seeing how close possibly Seattle might be to getting back a hold of this division. How you doing, Keith?
I'm doing good. It's good morning and good coffee, so let's do
Cheers.
this.
Yes, cheers. Here we go. Happy face.
Yours disappears. There's like a hole
I know
in the
it
middle
is.
of it.
It
I can
is
see the
kind of
background.
interesting. Yeah, interesting.
It's kind of odd.
Okay, so I just figured we'd just kind of go worst to best, if you will, in this conversation. And starting with Arizona, I don't think there's any real debate, at least on this show, but probably league wide, that Arizona is the worst team in the NFL this year for a number of reasons. They've just been a poor team overall. Lately, they fired their coach this last offseason, jettisoned their general manager, got some Rich Gannon coming in, defensive coordinator for the Philadelphia Eagles, and now is their head coach. They've got a new general manager.
Jonathan Gannon. Rich Gannon was the quarterback.
Sorry, Jonathan Gannon. And, depending on how their general manager does is how this team is going to go. I don't know that Kyler Murray is the long-term answer, and I don't think the team does either. And, I think the general manager of this team did what he needed to do this offseason to kind of reset and change directions a little bit. I thought they had a really decent offseason for their first offseason in what I believe is probably going to end up being like a 4-year rebuild. The Seahawks have been in, a 2-year, 3-year kind of rebuild, but this team is completely starting over from scratch, in my opinion.
Mm-hmm.
How do you feel?
No, I got to agree with you that they have, they've jettisoned so much talent, but it was all old talent.
Mm-hmm.
Guys like J.J. Watt and Zach Allen and guys that, let's face it, they're not going to be a part of this team when they get back to winning. And so are they going to be bad this year? Yeah, they're going to be bad, especially when Kyler Murray's probably not going to play for the first half of the season. And, they don't really have much as far as a backup there. This is a team that is resetting, getting out from underneath some bad contracts. Their biggest free agent acquisition was LJ Collier.
Well, yeah. Yes. Kaiser White, I thought the outside linebacker they signed.
Okay, I'll give you
from
that
Philadelphia
too,
was
still
actually really decent. And Gannon, their coach, knew him very, very well and signed him, paid him $10 million a year to come in. I thought that was a really good signing for them. You mentioned they did lose Zach Allen, Byron Murphy, Robbie Anderson, the wide receiver, Marcus Golden, I thought is an underrated loss for them, but they replaced him. DeAndre Hopkins, they gave away for free. Rodney Hudson still hasn't been signed by anybody. Their center, Justin Pugh, Zane Gonzalez, but they did re-sign a couple guys, Will and Hernandez to be their guard, Matt Prater, the kicker, Kelvin Beachum, kind of an underrated left tackle, I think, for them. But a backup guy, kind of a swing guy. And overall, I think they did okay. They did what they needed to do to kind of reset their roster, reset their salary cap for the future, not necessarily now. And then they went out and had a decent draft, I thought, overall.
They had a great draft. As far as bringing in actual talent this year, they had a good draft. But what they did was they set themselves up for next year, and where they have probably 5 picks in the top 65 at this point. Um, 2 could be in the top 3 overall. That's
Yeah.
they really built themselves a situation to be good next year.
Yeah. Yeah. And it's a good start for their general manager. I really do believe that. But you mentioned that the picks next year currently, if they finish last, they've got the first and second overall picks, 33rd pick, 65th, 66th, and 68th pick in this draft coming up next year. That's a lot of ammunition to rebuild a roster with good quality starting level picks or impact players in a rotation, including
Mhm.
a quarterback. And we can talk about Kyler Murray. I know that the team personally feels the immaturity level with him and the leadership qualities. He's just missing that piece. Physical talent obviously is there, but I don't know that they necessarily believe he's the answer to build a team around long term. And I do believe that they move on next year. After this year, you mentioned the fact that he might not start until midway through the season. There's a possibility he might not even see the field this year. Now
It's
they don't
yeah.
have a lot back, behind him. Colt McCoy is slated to take the starting spot. They did draft Clayton Tune in the draft, which I really liked as kind of a guy that you bring in and you bring along and see where he's at in a year or two. But he may be pressed into service right away. Colt McCoy has got a history of injury, and the way that their offensive line is currently constructed, along with the first round draft pick Paris Johnson there on the left side, which I think is going to be a great pick for them long term. They may have some issues protecting their quarterback this year. So it's going to be a rough season for them. I would anticipate them winning anywhere from 1 to 3 games, and that's kind of where they're at.
Yeah. I agree with that. I mean, they're just not they're not a good football team right now. Um, we were, talking about Kyler Murray. If the Cardinals were to cut them right now, which they're not going to, they would have um, negative. It cost them 34.3 million in cap space. Like they would lose that much.
And the
Uh,
Seahawks did something similar, if you remember correctly, and then you take all the other dead cap salaries that are on the books for Seattle. Seattle kind of went through that last year, where they had about
mhm.
$45 million in dead cap space.
Yep.
And sometimes, when you're in this position, especially where Arizona's at, where you're going to finish dead last no matter what you do, you might take that hit. But
Mhm.
I think it's fair to say that they would like to be able to trade him as a tradable asset at some point. And so I think it makes sense for them to wait a year on that. But
Yep.
yeah,
So
crazy.
um a year from now though, they could move him after June 1st. Um still have a pile of dead money, 48.3 million in dead money, but they would still gain 3.5 million in cap space. So it becomes a movable contract a year from now, but right now it really isn't.
Yeah. And if somebody's really interested in a guy where maybe that leadership role doesn't necessarily need to fall squarely on his shoulders with a team, but yet they could use an upgraded quarterback, that might be an interesting scenario for them. I like their draft overall. I mentioned Paris Johnson, the best left tackle in the draft. They
Mhm.
picked him at the sixth overall pick. Ojulari, the edge from LSU. Garrett Williams, the cornerback. Michael Wilson, underrated at wide receiver if he can stay healthy. I think that's a great pick for them in the fourth round. John Gaines is one of my favorite middle to late round picks to be an offensive center in this league, um, out of UCLA. Clayton Tune, I mentioned the quarterback, developmental kind of guy at this point, but we'll see what happens there. I kind of like his upside. And overall, they got some speed at linebacker. Papo from Auburn in the sixth round. Kytrell Clark, the cornerback, nice size for him. And Dante Stills, the defensive tackle, really liked him coming out of West Virginia as well. So I like their draft, but they've got such a long way to go. Their roster is really lacking any depth at all, and their starter level positions are just probably some of the worst roster in the NFL right now. So long ways to go for them, and
Mhm.
Seahawks are not concerned about the Arizona Cardinals in 2023, but the future looks pretty good for them. So
Yeah,
we'll see.
they they're setting up themselves to rebuild in the right way. They're getting young, but they're amassing assets that they can then use to rebuild a roster. And in the NFL, when you've got a lot of draft picks, you can rebuild a roster in a couple of years. You really can.
And we've seen that. Yeah. And speaking of rebuilding, we got another team that's rebuilding, and there's mixed signals out there about how people feel about the Los Angeles Rams. I don't think there's any mixed signals in this room. We both
No.
think that the Los Angeles Rams are a poor team, poor roster construction right now. Had the Super Bowl a couple of years ago, but their books became reconciled this offseason, and the salary cap was really evident when they basically lost Matt Gay, Odell Beckham Jr., their best safety, Nick Scott, outside linebacker Leonard Floyd. They didn't want to retain Bobby Wagner. Ashawn Robinson left. Their starting level or backup, level quarterback Baker Mayfield is gone, etc.
Greg Gaines, Jalen
Great Gaines,
Ramsey.
exactly. Riley Dixon, their punter. It just goes on and on. And Taylor Rapp, David Long, Troy Hill, their corner, Malcolm Brown, their backup running back. They re-signed guard Coleman Shelton and Marquise Copeland, the defensive tackle, and went out and signed Demarcus Robinson and Brett Rippon to be their backup quarterback. And that's the extent of their free agency. But
Mhm.
it's way more losses than gains on that list, and they didn't have a great roster to begin with.
Mm-mm.
And then you go into the draft. They didn't pick until the 36th pick overall. I did like their pick, and Steve Avila out of TCU. I think he's going to start for them at guard,
He will.
and Byron Young, the edge player out of Tennessee, he's got some upside there. And after that, it's just a bunch of names. Really, there's a lot of depth there. There's really no highlights to speak of,
I thought
and I don't.
given where they're at as a team and the rebuild process, that 4th round pick of Stetson Bennett felt like such a waste.
I agree. Yeah, no, I agree. Yeah. So what I'm saying is, I don't see how anybody out there in the NFL world that writes for a living, follows teams and creates lists and all that kind of stuff has this team any higher than 25th in the league,
Yeah.
and potentially being the second worst roster in the league. They have a chance to only win 3 or 4 games themselves and be fighting with the Cardinals in a race
Mhm.
for the best quarterback taken in the 2024 draft.
Well, what they've got is Matthew Stafford at quarterback, Cooper Kupp at wide receiver, Cam Akers at running back, Aaron Donald, on the defensive line,
Yeah.
and that's
The-
4 stars, and which is 4 more than Arizona has. And I think that's
right. Yeah,
why people are overlooking all the other losses is because
I agree.
at the very top of the roster, you still have those guys. The problem is just everything underneath them. And in NFL this is a team game, right? The best roster tends to win, not the best individual player. This isn't the NBA. Um, and so I mean, I get that there's a little bit of fool's gold there because of things, but that's I believe the reason why people are overlooking the loss of talent.
Yeah, I mean, they've got a few other pieces like Tyler Higbee at tight end. Van Jefferson isn't a bad wide receiver. But beyond that, Keith, beyond that, they just don't have anything. It's
Mhm.
just filler, roster filler type stuff. Guys that aren't long term in their long term plans. Save a couple of their draft picks. It so yeah, I agree. I think their roster is talent poor, depth is non-existent, and you mentioned Aaron Donald. He didn't play after Thanksgiving last year.
Mhm.
I think people think that he's going to be the difference maker if he has a full season. I'm just not sure at this point. He's getting a little older as well. He's still a great player, but every year you're going to have diminishing returns now with him. And then Matthew Stafford really didn't play very much last year, and when he did, he was not effective. And I'm not sure if that is diminishing returns at this point or not, or if he was just nagged with injury. So we'll see. But I see them again being a team that's going to win between 4 and 6 games at best, and I
Yeah,
don't
4
see
seems
them
like the
being.
right.
Here's the deal too. Anything can happen in the NFC. As we were doing research, and I'm sure you came to this conclusion as well. There's really only 5 teams in the NFC that would be in the top 15 overall in the NFL as far
Yeah.
as team rankings are concerned. It's very poor in the NFC as far as good teams, and you never know. A team like the Rams could sneak in somehow or another with 7 or 8 wins, into the playoffs, and that's
Yeah.
the kind of year it's going to be in the NFC.
They're gonna I mean, they would have to pull off a couple of, pretty dramatic upsets, but, a couple, yeah, they do that because of the stars that they've got. And if they get good, production out of guys like Steve Avila and Byron Young, and Kobe Turner, right, their first 3 draft picks, they
Hmm.
could, they can stay in some games and maybe steal a couple and get themselves to 7 wins and maybe that last playoff spot. I don't see it happening, but it's possible.
Right.
I think this is a 4-win team. I think Arizona is a 2-win team.
So the more that you did your research and you've seen the offseason now between Seattle and San Francisco, how do you
Um,
feel about the race at the top, Keith?
this is a really hard one to handicap because, Arizona's biggest problem is the most important position. And on top of that, you're
You
gonna
mean San
have
Francisco?
I said Arizona, didn't I? Yeah, San Francisco. Their biggest problem is at quarterback, and the rest of that roster is really damn good. But they've got to figure out what's going on at quarterback. Um, is Brock Purdy going to be able to play? Is he healthy? Even if he can go, is he going to be able to play at the level he did last year, or was some of that a little bit of a mirage? Now that there's tape on him, will teams, figure out what he does and doesn't do, and come up with ways to slow him down? If he can't go, can Trey Lance finally live up to some of the potential that he's got? Um, does Sam Darnold end up playing meaningful snaps this season? These are a lot of really big questions at the really important position. Um, but overall, that's a pretty damn good roster.
It's
It
a pretty
really
good
is.
roster. I thought they lost some players that were important to them. Right tackle Mike
Mhm.
McGlinchey is the big one. He got paid, went and left. Samson Ibukum, the defensive end, I thought is underrated. Charles Ameniu, who we both like. Jimmy Ward at safety, kind of an underrated player. Emmanuel Mosley, the cornerback, left. And, they just signed some lower level kind of roster filler type things. But it went out and probably, I think, signed one of the best players available in free agency in
They
Devon
did,
Hargrave, and then Isaiah Oliver as well to come in and start for them at corner.
which
Um,
they needed. Corner was the weakness on their defense, and Oliver is gonna come in and start right away. I think that was a good pickup.
I do too. And then they had an okay draft. They didn't draft until the 87th pick overall. They drafted a bunch of roster filler. Jake Moody they drafted with the pick 99 overall to be their
Their
kicker.
second pick, they
Yeah,
took
what?
a kicker with their second overall pick. When you do that, you are telling basically everybody you're in win now mode.
Yeah,
you're taking
you
the
can
you're,
afford to take a kicker at 99.
yeah, you're filling your roster with whatever it is needed for filler because you don't need um to go get guys. You know what I mean? Um,
Hmm.
Azir Brown, the safety out of Penn State, I think actually can be pretty good. He's a guy that, again, the defensive backfield, that's where they were
Yeah.
weaker. They lost one of their safeties. They drafted a safety. Um, we'll see how that works out for them as far as overall quality of play, but good player. And then after that, like
I did
I
like
don't know.
Darrell Luter Jr. I thought he was an underrated corner out of South Alabama. I think he's going to play minutes for them, and snaps, and we'll see. But overall, they didn't really need. They had a little bit of room to lose players and still have a great roster. Javon
Mhm.
Hargrave just kind of, you can just stop after you sign him,
That
because really,
defensive line was good before they signed him.
exactly, exactly. I mean, they got
So,
Nick Bosa, Kerry Hyder, to back him up. Javon Hargrave, Javon Kinlaw to back him up. Eric Armstead, Kevin Givens there as well, and Drake Jackson, who they picked up, year prior, to be a good defensive end for them, and Clellan Farrell to back him up. I mean, that line is loaded. Then you've got Fred Warner, behind that, making plays. So
mhm.
I like their defense, Keith. They've got probably the best, well, not probably, the best defense in the division, and probably the second best defense, I think, overall in the NFC, behind Philadelphia.
I don't know.
And
They've got the best defensive line in the
yes,
NFL,
I agree with that.
and that
I,
that that makes everything else on defense work. When you
but
win up front on every play, it's
yeah,
gonna be real hard on other teams.
now when you take a look at their offense, Keith, Kyle Shanahan has them playing super efficient with under Purdy. Can they
Mhm.
duplicate that, with Trey Lance? I'm not sure. They could probably get close to that with Sam Darnold, if he was just dinking and dunking. And I would imagine, a quarterback coach and head coach and Kyle Shanahan can get the best out of Sam Darnold, but I just don't know what that is. And then Purdy, I think you talked about, can he duplicate what he did? I think he can, in the playing style that he had, getting the ball out quickly, efficiently, going through his reads pretty well last year. I think that that's something that you can duplicate, and I think that they definitely hope that he can start the year for them, even if he can't throw the ball 40 yards down the field. Um, he could at least do 85% of their offense, and
Mhm.
and um, and I think, Jared Goff with the Rams a few years back proved that could carry that offense if needed for a while.
Or Jimmy Garoppolo on San
Right,
Francisco,
right.
did the same thing. So, yeah.
So you would think that that would be the team to beat in the NFC, just by virtue of default. They're the repeat team. They're the team that's done it, a couple of years in a row now. But here are the Seahawks.
Mhm.
We had a great offseason again. Geno Smith came in last year, proved he could be the quarterback, of the now, maybe not of the future, but and they continued to build the roster. They didn't really have any losses last year, as far as, major losses in free agency. Went out and signed Draymond Jones and a few other players, including bringing back Bobby Wagner. They had a great draft again. Got the best cornerback in the draft, as well as the best wide receiver, maybe the second best running back. And you can kind of go through that list. And I think the additions to a playoff, team last year really put them squarely in a point in their evolution on a rebuild, where they're in contention right now, especially in a diminished and weakened NFC.
Yeah, and that's the thing is the NFC is really weak at the moment, and you need to be able to get into the playoffs and take your shot when you get there. Um, and I mean, and that's where the Seahawks are built. The question comes down to, do they get to play home games? Um, because can they have to finish above San Francisco, and that's really the question. Are they the team that's going to win this division, or is San Francisco still gonna hold on to it? And it's like I said, it's hard it's hard to say because San Francisco still has the better overall roster, but the quarterback situation is a mess. So it's going to be an interesting season. Well, I don't know where we're going to go with that. I like what Seattle's done. I like what they've done is putting things together. This also is not a deep team with Seattle. There's a reason why they had to sign a record number of undrafted players, is because they just didn't have guys on the roster. There's
Yeah,
a
but
lot of
if you
gaps.
like even there was a conversation yesterday on Twitter with Bob Condata and others, and he was talking about how many undrafted rookie free agents that he would expect made the roster, made the team, made the 53, and he said zero. And he said all 10 draft picks, but no undrafted rookie free agents. He said maybe a guy like Bobo at wide receiver would, but he established him more as a practice squad guy. He pointed to a couple other guys, particularly the safety that they had that they really liked. I'm trying to find his name right now. Jonathan Sutherland,
Mhm.
as two most likely candidates, but those were still fringy. And so while we did do that, Keith, I think that the roster's a little deeper than most people give them credit for.
Yeah, I mean, I get where you're going with that, is because basically they built a 53-man roster in the offseason, instead of a 90-man roster. The problem with that is that you go into training camp and you're gonna lose 6 or 7 of those guys to injury during camp and preseason. And that's just the nature of the NFL. You've gotta have depth behind them. And at this moment, I don't see it. I see
Interesting.
when a guy gets hurt, right? Um, Pick any defensive lineman, right? If one of the starters gets hurt, so now you, instead of these guys that are currently slated as backups, you're like, hey, rotationally wise, that's not bad. Okay, now those guys become starters, and you look below them and you go, there's nothing there.
Hmm. I think that's
Uh,
true with most teams, but I think Seattle's actually in pretty decent shape there. I agree with you. You pointed to the one position group, I think, where we can't afford to have too many injuries, for sure. Um, and I don't even want to talk about them. I
and
don't
line
even want to talk about injuries right now
and
because
and
I don't want to
linebacker
jinx anything.
linebacker isn't any better. So, and you're like, oh, defensive line, yeah, go look at linebacker too. Um,
It
it's
sure
it
certainly gets a lot better when Jordan Brooks is healthy.
Yes,
It
but
looks a lot better. Yeah.
the front seven has a lot of talent. It doesn't have depth, and that scares me. And that's what we're looking at, for this team. If they can stay healthy, they can play with anybody. But depth matters in the NFL. It truly does. If you
Yeah.
look at the 2013, 2014 teams when Seattle was, winning a Super Bowl and another one, um, who that was a stacked roster top to bottom. They had tremendous depth because
Yeah.
they dealt with injuries all year, and it didn't matter. And that's the same kind of thing that San Francisco has had the last couple of years, is they've had injuries. It didn't really matter until it was all their quarterbacks.
Yeah, and you take a look at the evolution of roster building, and we're basically where Seattle or where San Francisco was 2 years ago.
Mhm,
San Francisco has a mature roster. When you go look at our depth, while the quality of players looks decent, a lot of those are first and second year players, rookies.
mhm.
Jackson Smith and Jigba is going to be the slot wide receiver for this team. You look at Damian Lewis at left guard. His backup is an undrafted rookie free agent and Kendall Randolph. You go look at center. Oluwatimi is a rookie, and he's right behind Evan Brown. They're going to be in competition.
Mhm.
Anthony Bradford is the main right guard backup, with Phil Haynes there, and Phil Haynes has a history of injury problems. So Anthony Bradford's immediately probably in that starting role conversation.
Well,
And
then
you
then
and
look at the defensive backfield, right?
right.
You're gonna have Witherspoon, who's a rookie, Woolen, who's gonna be in year 2, Quandre Diggs is a veteran, and once Jamal Adams gets hurt sometime in week 1, Jarek Reed's probably gonna be the starter at strong safety, another rookie. And so you're gonna have 3 out of the 4 guys there being first or second year players.
Mhm. No doubt. No doubt. And like you said, there's not much behind Bobby Wagner and stuff. But okay. So final question, we'll wrap this show up. How do you feel about the NFC West? You just went through kind of the negatives the negative worst case scenario options for Seattle. What's the best case scenario for Seattle?
Well, the best case scenario, like I said, if they stay healthy, they can play with anybody, especially on offense. This offense is set up to be elite, like 33 point a game average, and the defense just has to hold on to that. I mean, this offense is set up to be very, very good, and like I said, they can play with anybody. And if they can get some turnovers and some stops, they're going to win a lot of games. I think that this is like an 11-win team. This is definitely a playoff team. If they don't win the division because San Francisco holds them off for one more year, then they're probably the top wild card spot. So, um,
Yes.
yeah, I mean, this is a quality team, and same with San Francisco. That's another quality team. Um, you've got two of probably the top 5 or 6 teams in the NFC in this division. You've also got 2 of the bottom teams in the entire
Yes.
NFL in this division.
Which makes it easier for both Seattle and San Francisco to get those.
Yeah, because
wins.
that's 4 wins between, playing in division games. That's 4 easy wins, and then if they split playing each other, that's 5, and then that's where they're at setting up going forward. That's a good spot to be in when you're trying to make the playoffs.
Yep. Interesting. Okay. So let's get out of here. Our next show, we're going to take a look at a wider look at the NFC overall. We're going to rank the top 10 teams in the NFC. We'll find out where Seattle falls in that, San Francisco as well. So that'll be an interesting look. Maybe, and we haven't planned this yet, but maybe we can take a look at the AFC as well coming up in a future show. Okay. You can find Keith at Myers NFL. You can find me at NW Seahawk. The show is Seahawks Playbook Podcast. Find it on your favorite podcast platform. Find us on our YouTube channel, and make sure you hit that subscribe button and share it. Comment on it if you like it. And that's it. So until next time, go Hawks.
Go Hawks.
Seahawks Playbook Podcast listeners, thanks for joining us for another edition of the show. You can find us on Twitter. Bill is at NW Seahawk. Keith is at Myers NFL. And the show is at Hawks Playbook. You can listen and subscribe to the show at SeahawksPlaybook.com.